I think eros is often confused with lust in our world, and it's not that. It's a deeper, more powerful, broader, richer vein of desire that can unify and can unite without confusion different aspects both of ourselves and of the cosmos. It has to be real, otherwise it's not eros. It can't just be a kind of lip service to kindness.
Welcome to Psychology and the Cross. In this episode, I speak to Pia Chaudhari about her book Dynamis of Healing, Patristic Theology and the Psyche, published by Fordham University Press. Pia holds a doctorate in theology from the Department of Psychiatry and Religion at Union Theological Seminary in New York, and she's a founding co-chair of the Analytical Psychology and Orthodox Christianity Consultation. Thank you for listening in on our conversation. So, welcome to the podcast, Pia Chaudhari. Today we're gonna discuss your book, Dynamis of Healing, Patristic Theology and the Psyche, which was published in 2019 by Fordham University Press. It took me some time to read through the book, but I would just want to say that it's a beautiful book and very thoroughly written. What you're doing is tying links between the tradition and practice of Orthodox Christianity and Patristic theology with the field of depth psychology specifically, or more focus on analytical psychology. So we're going to talk about the book, and we're going to talk about your findings in all this research. But before diving into the book, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about yourself and maybe what led up to you writing this book.
Yes, I mean, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's really wonderful to have a second conversation with you now, and to explore some of these topics. Yeah, it's not a book I ever imagined myself writing. It's not something I set out to do a long time ago, but it was a kind of culmination of, I guess, many years of wonderings, if that makes sense, that I care deeply about healing. I always have. And at a certain point in my journey, I became Christian, which was also an unexpected move for me. And Christianity is a religion that, I mean, we don't always hear this emphasis, but in fact is very focused on healing, that the church is a hospital, and that even the early understanding of the word salvation had, I think it's true to say that the early church used the word therapia, that there was a therapy of the world taking place. So there is this idea that something was actually being healed and restored, and not just kind of in an abstract way saved. And so I wondered about, I come from my father was a scientist. I grew up in a scientific world, and I tried to hold these two areas together for a long time. There's science, there's psychiatry, there's psychology, and then there's religion, and there's faith, and there's apparently now what I was coming to understand in my own journey, this whole area of healing in the church as well. So I think for quite some time I just wondered, without doing much about it, how do these areas relate? Do they relate? Can God cure depression? How does this work? And eventually I found myself in seminary and had the chance to work in a really fantastic program that was run at the time by Anne Ulanov, and at the time it was called the Department of Psychiatry and Religion. And this just seemed like a place to really wrestle out a lot of these questions, working with the, primary sources from Freud, from Jung, Winnicott, Fairbairn. It was really a deep dive. And at the same time, I was studying early church history with Father John McGuckin, who is an Orthodox theologian, church historian. And so in a way, the holding of the two areas was coming closer together. At least I had everything in one school now, and was able to go from office to office rather than from school to, medical school to religious school. And so the worlds were coming closer, and yeah, I began to see and feel and trust that there were really what I call in the book meeting places, that there's some kind of sense of integration, which is in fact something that both Eastern Orthodox theology and depth psychology, as you know, emphasize. And it made sense to me after a while that of course there would have to be, because we are one creature. And so for our psyches not to be split between the sort of the divine and the natural, or it would have to be integrated in us in some way. And I think that that's where I began to find that no, it's not as simplistic as, oh, God will just cure your depression if you pray hard enough. That I think is a very dangerous place to go sometimes. But it is true that it's all connected and in some way, and that there are places of shared understanding between Orthodox theology and depth psychology.
And how come that you were drawn to or started to go into Orthodox Christianity of the different? Can you say something
Right.
about Orthodox?
Well, yeah, and again, one more path I never imagined myself on. I wasn't raised with any connection, although my beloved second family was Serbian Orthodox. So I had a little bit of exposure as a child growing up, but that was it. I think what happened is I got to seminary, and as I mentioned, I was studying with Father John McGuckin early church history, because I had some experiences that led me towards Christianity, but I wanted to explore them. I wanted to explore them in my own way, if that makes sense. I think a lot of young people who arrive in seminary and aren't necessarily on ordination track have questions, and I had questions, and I wanted to get back as close in time to the original event, the Christic event, as they call it, and then go from there to see what I was going to make of Christianity. I didn't want 2,000 years of accretions on top of it in my understanding. And so I spent some time in what I later came to understand as early church history, and then also early church theology. And I found it captivating, and in large part because there was a very strong emphasis on experience, that the church fathers were writing out of an experience that they'd had, that this was experiential. It wasn't abstract or cerebral, as heady as they can be. Mm-hmm. There was a real sense of connectedness to lived life, and that they had experienced something that led them to then change their lives, to write, to reflect, to sacrifice themselves in many cases as well. So I was drawn to that. And I also found increasingly that it seemed many of the questions I had about, sort of, as I got further along the theological journey and was able to ask more maybe involved or sophisticated questions of the theology than I had been previously, I had concerns about atonement theory and understandings of Christ's sacrifice, and wouldn't that in fact lead us to some kind of setup within ourselves, if are humans bad and God had to sacrifice himself to save us, and so what is and doesn't that kind of clash with a therapeutic understanding that we're not bad and we have to work to heal? And so I had these kinds of questions, and I found that within the Orthodox Church there was much, every time I would ask these questions, they would be answered in a way that made sense to me. That yes, there is a sacrificial aspect, but we also have to focus on the incarnation, and we also have to understand that this was a question, much like in therapy, it was almost like a rescue mission rather than a kind of the sort of penal substitution of God had to die himself to satisfy God's own honor, the kind of legalistic understandings that came later or were emphasized later. Some of them were there from the beginning. So I don't know if that really quite addresses what you're saying, but I think I found space in the church for understandings that did not contraindicate or contradict what I was also learning in my study of depth psychology and in my own therapeutic journey.
And could you say something short about also that, the therapeutic journey and Jung and analytical psychology, how you got involved in that, and also practiced as a therapist?
Yeah, I mean, I was, Well, I had the great good fortune to study with, really wonderful teachers at Union and Harry Fogarty, both of whom are Jungian, and in the Department of Psychiatry and Religion, and I found that there was a capaciousness there for, again, all kinds of experience, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much the listeners will be interested to know in the differences between, say, Jung and Freud, but one of the, as you know, one of the main differences as I experience it is that there isn't just the emphasis on the reductive in Jung, that this idea that we, have to go back in time to find the origin of the wound or the trauma and then kind of wrestle through it. But there's also the prospective. There's the question is, where is the person going? Where is the symptom taking them? And not just where does it originate? And what is the telos of their journey? And so I found that very enlivening, because it's a very, very hopeful paradigm, I think, for healing, to have, as someone come in and say, oh, well, I've got this and this, or I've got this depression, or I've got this crazy fantasy that keeps coming up, or I've got, this kind of, compulsion. And, one of my dear colleagues in my former training institute is working right now on a whole paper and book on compulsion and the role that it plays in moving us forward if we can understand it, properly. So this idea of symbol or symptom as symbol, and not just symptom as pathology or issue to be removed, was very, very powerful. And, and again, just to link it back, this kind of, it's almost an allegorical way of thinking, which was, really a big part of early church theology. I mean, Origen and others used allegory all the time to understand scripture and to understand theology.
So for people like myself who are not well versed in Orthodox Christianity or Patristic Theology, I wonder if it would be possible to give some context or to define some key fundamentals of Orthodox teaching that can be helpful as we're exploring these, what you call meeting places between the field of Orthodox Christianity and analytical psychology.
Yeah, I mean, it's a vast question.
It
might be that along the way it's easier to kind of flesh out a few things, but I will say that maybe the first thing to know, that what comes to mind anyway, to me, the first thing is that Orthodox Christianity is a sacramental Christianity. So there's a heavy emphasis on the sacraments, which are in fact considered meeting places between the human and the divine. And back, I think it was in the 12th century, St. Gregory of Palamas wrote extensively on the difference between the divine energies of God, the sort of uncreated energies of God, and then the created energies of creation. And so it brings a few things in, which is, the first is that the belief that God can be experienced directly in the sacraments. And it's not a cerebral experiencing. It's not a moral experiencing. I was just reading earlier a wonderful quote by St. Maximus about that, which I can bring up later. But it's a direct experience of the uncreated energies of the divine, which then imbue our we are created, and we're on this side of creation, along with all of creation. We are created. We're not the creator, and so the sacrament is the meeting place between the uncreated and the created. And so that gave me then an immediate, the second you bring experience in, you can now reflect on it. And the second you're reflecting on experience, you're already in the realm of depth psychology to some degree. So that's sort of how that got set up. It's also a very sensuous experience of the church. They're the icons and the incense and the flames and the smell of the beeswax and the chanting and the paintings on the wall. It really brings your whole, there's prostrations and there's fasting and there's feasting and there, so there's it's very embodied, which also gave me a place from which to engage with the psychology.
The second chapter in the book, you've given the title, "That which is not assumed is not healed,"
right.
Which is, as I understand, the core maxim of patristic theology. And I think the quote was from St. Gregory of Nazianz.
Yes. Yeah, Nazian.
And with that quote, that which is not assumed is not healed, you start to draw links to depth psychology and the valuing of the shadowy parts of the human psyche or the id,
Right.
and integration of parts or complexes that we
Right.
might not want to face.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is really core. I think you've gone right to the heart of the matter, because I think many people confuse religion with morality, and as such have a kind of, understandably so, a fidelity to a certain moral, I say not even moral stance, but a moral self-understanding.
Mhm.
And one of the things that Jung, I think, struggled with in his own, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, that, Jung was the son of a pastor and grew up in a certain time in I guess you could say in Protestant history, where the, when you read his writings, he's obviously struggling to find the meaning in the symbols of the church. And so anyway, so Jung goes on his own journey, and when he writes about the shadow and the need to encounter the shadow, I think over time he really developed his thinking on the shadow. But I think initially there was just some sense of, oh, hey, look, you've got to really confront who you really are, not who you think you ought to be from a moral standpoint. And kind of like the Pharisee and the Republican. Well, thank God I'm not someone who is envious or spiteful or greedy or jealous. And then, of course, you go into analysis and you find out you're all those things. And so I think he was sort of reckoning with the shadow in a way that the church actually encourages people to do as well through confession. But of course, in the Protestant church, you didn't have confession. So that's sort of, one difference there. But I think that this idea that we would split away from the parts of ourselves that don't meet our own moral standards or our own sense of who we are or want to be, I mean, that's sort of depth psychology 101, right? But the idea then that the danger then in bringing religion into that is that, of course, we can then say, well, there's the danger of putting kind of a God complex, I would say, rather than God on the throne there, that says, well, don't go there into that part of yourself. I mean, don't look at the porn addiction, don't look at the cheating or the lying or the the stealing or any of that, because God hates that about you, and you've got to, you can maybe take it to confession, hopefully you are, but it's nothing to be explored or understood in any particular way. Whereas Jung would say, oh, well, let's go right there and see what's going on. And so I think that which is not assumed is not healed was a kind of, it just rang so clearly in my head through the centuries of, my goodness, if that's what they were saying, and they were saying it also with regards to, I mean, to many things, it was also to as Maximus picked it up later, had to do also with the human will. But it was a basic understanding of, if we are being saved by Christ, then Christ must have within himself all of who we are. Because if there's any part of us that is not in his human experience, it cannot be saved by him. Does that make sense? I don't think I'm saying this very eloquently, but
Yes.
if he knows suffering, then suffering can be healed. If he knows grief, then grief can be healed. But the temptation then, of course, is to say, yes, but of course Christ never did steal, and he never did kill, and he didn't, do all these terrible things that we do. But he has to have had the ability to do it, or else our will can't be healed, right? His will was free. He has to have had a free human will. And so I kind of elaborated on that to say, okay, but then, so we're also talking about the psyche then, like all of the psyche has to have been assumed into this project of therapia, of salvation. Otherwise, there's just parts of our psyche hanging out that can't be healed. And that's surely not what the fathers were saying. So that means even our porn addiction, even our envy, even our murder has to have some place in it where healing can happen, some place where redemption can happen, and not just in a juridical sense of like you're absolved and you can still, have a shot at heaven someday. It's more, can it be reached, and can it be integrated, and can it be pulled back? And I found such a depth of wisdom in the patristics around, again, it's tricky because you don't want to be sort of anachronistic in the using of the language, but Pseudo Dionysus talks about how everything has to participate to some degree, however minute, in the good, because if it didn't, it wouldn't exist, because God is the good and God is being. And so even someone who has a life filled with what you might call sin or complexes or however is still attached, is still participating in life, and so therefore is still connected to the good. And that's the starting point. And then I think where Jung took it further is then to say, sort of circling back to what we were talking about earlier, okay, but even this point of sin now, does it have a purpose? Does it have a meaning? Is there, what is behind I'll just use again the pornography, addiction online? It's so rampant that, is there a search for intimacy here? Is there a desire for communion here? It may be distorted, quote unquote, but is something trying to happen here? So rather than writing it off as a sin, why don't you explore it and see what it's trying to pull the person towards? And it seemed to me that when you do that, you will often find one of the goods of life behind that, the pulling the person towards eros and communion and desire and all of those things that are embedded in it for them. So I think it's a very important understanding that God's grace is so beyond what we think it is when we set ourselves up as God, and that it all is assumed in some way. It has to be all of the human experience. Again, not to say that God in Christ, if you're Christian, assumed all of the sins, but all of the psyche was there, and it's the psyche that it's all rooted in, if that makes sense.
As you speak, I got curious about if the Orthodox Church and sacraments, if you would say that it holds the therapeutic process alive, or if there are things there that it would learn from or benefit from depth psychology, or if it already has a depth psychology sort of integrated into it.
Well, I think, we some years ago with some colleagues, we started something called the Analytical Psychology and Orthodox Christianity Consultation. It's called APOCC. And we started putting together some gatherings to try to address exactly some of these questions. So we would invite Orthodox priests and speakers, and we would invite Jungian analysts, and we would try and get a conversation going just across the border, as it were. And I think it's a tricky thing to say. It's both a tricky thing to say that neither one can learn from the other, and it's a tricky thing to say that they can learn from each other, because they're not operating with the same set of assumptions and the same set of values. So I think you always have to be very careful to respect that these are two very different animals meeting each other, if I may use that image, and not to expect them to act like each other or to appreciate or want or desire the same things necessarily. That said, this is also why I wanted to find out whether there were any meeting places, right? And mainly just, again, because otherwise, we risk being very split as persons. So I think that, I'll just say this, that one of the areas of conversation that was lively was around the issue of like fantasy, for example. So, the Orthodox world does have a certain kind of depth psychology, in my experience. It certainly runs very deep. And of course, many, priests and spiritual fathers and mothers now are also psychologically informed. So it's sort of hard to say what's to just tease out. It's as if they've never influenced each other, but of course they have. But I think that there's always a concern about fantasy and what can come in is one thing that I've experienced. So when you're in this, in the clinical room and a client comes in and has a dream about, I don't know, a demon or a nightmare with a demon or something, we tend to not immediately assume it's an actual demon, but that what's going on, what's the psyche, what's the dream ego saying, you kind of interpret it and analyze it. I think that images like that and others like sexual images or violent images have had a different meaning in the Orthodox Church as more of a, if not overtly demonic, but as a symptom of passions that are, or sins that are in need of tending. And they can be tended to with compassion, but they're still seen maybe less. I mean, I could be wrong, but I would propose that they're seen less symbolically than in-depth psychology, that the idea that there might be something else behind this image that's just trying to happen as a psychological event is not as focused on, understandably, because their focus of the interior life in the Orthodox Church is the union with God through prayer. So it's a different emphasis, and in that life you can have a lot of images come up that they will look at more as temptations or as something to be prayed perhaps through, whereas we might in the Jungian world tend to look at them more as, oh, look, here's a fantasy, let's work with the image. So it's a different emphasis.
And on that note, I wanted to ask as well about dreams. Like historically, is that something that has been valued or put emphasis on in the tradition, or is it more a skepticism, or is there something you can say about that on dreams?
Well, I'm not really an expert on that, so I haven't studied dreams very much in the church tradition, but it is striking that they do show up in scripture.
Yeah.
And, it says warned in a dream, and, an angel appeared in a dream. And so there's a kind of, I think there was a openness to dreams. But again, I think where you will, as I'm thinking out loud right now, I think that the main area you run into trouble is that, and this is a question of method, the Orthodox, and so let me lay this out without saying that I'm agreeing or disagreeing with one side or the other, but this is my experience of each one, is that in the Orthodox Church, you are talking about the ultimate, right? You're talking about God. And there are truth claims that are made about God. In the Jungian world, Jung himself says, no one can know what the ultimate things are. So I'm going to talk about psyche, and that's all I can talk about. And then, of course, he talks about God endlessly, but you're supposed to have caught that first caveat he makes where he's saying, I'm not speaking as a theologian, I'm speaking as a psychologist. The danger, I think, on the Orthodox side, of course, is when you make truth claims about God, you are making claims about the ultimate. And so people who don't share those, of course, are not going to understand or agree. But it's that is the nature of religion, and that's the nature of the church, to make these claims. I think the danger on the Jungian side can be that it becomes that the psyche is all encapsulating, that everything is psyche, and you can't ever have an experience of God, because even that's a psychological experience that's generated by psyche. And I think that's the danger on the Jungian side. So, but if you respect, again, that they each are coming from those two places, and you understand that then there's going to be a limitation on how much you can agree on, then okay, but you can still have a conversation. It's still an interesting conversation to have. You just have to understand that there's two very different places that we're speaking from.
When I would say just that kind of warning to the field of depth psychology to make everything into psyche, it reminds me of what Sean McGrath, which has been a guest on the show, and we also did a podcast together called Secular Christ. He speaks about psychological absolutism and the dangers of that, and the limits of psychology, and understanding that better. But I was also thinking, as we ambulated around, and as you help to unpack this beautiful quote, "That which is not assumed is not healed." I was thinking about a book that came out a few years ago, and I don't know if you saw it, but it became very popular. It's called No Bad Parts, by this Richard Schwartz, who developed a therapeutic system or technique called the internal family system, which is becoming very, very popular. Which basically works much like active imagination, that you get in contact with different parts and start dialogues. But it's a little bit more, I would say, maybe a bit more concrete and a bit more systematized. But it's just something with that title, No Bad Parts, because it connects to the idea that it's all there for some sort of reason, and that we have to be open to examine it and to look at it and assume to see it.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that I think it is important to say, and I mean, obviously there are many different types of schools of depth psychology, and many analysts out there, and so there's a whole wide range. But I think Jung talked about how you can only be morally responsible for that which you're conscious of, right? And so I do want to clarify that it's not, in my understanding at least, that okay, if everything is assumed and there are no bad parts, that then therefore everything goes. Anything, you can do whatever you want, it doesn't matter. It's not, I don't think that Jung himself was sort of disavowing any kind of moral stance towards ourselves or the community around us, but simply saying that, first of all, you can't be morally responsible for what you're not in control of, and you're not in control of the unconscious, and you're not in control of the conscious. But, like, you don't have even an understanding of why you're doing this kind of compulsion or whatever it is. And then secondly, that yes, there is every possibility that there is something really valuable hidden for you here. So even that, and that's what we have to make conscious, is what's really going on. And then you can see whether you want to keep doing this or not, and how that squares with your own morality. But let me just read you this little quote. It's in the book, and I just came across it earlier, and it was St. Maximus, and I was just reminded of how powerful this is. I think because I think it's so easily forgotten in our world in general, and it's not just the church that has morality, as a kind of banner it waves, and it's just a kind of interesting quote for I think our times in general. But he said that this was him writing on the Lord's Prayer, that the spirit has to persuade the intellect to desist from moral philosophy in order to commune with the supra-essential logos through direct and undivided contemplation. For when the intellect has become free from its attachment to sensible objects, it should not be burdened any longer with preoccupation about morality as with a shaggy cloak. And I just love this idea of morality, preoccupations as a shaggy cloak. And I like to think that Freud would have liked that too. And of course, so Maximus is talking about this idea, again, sort of direct and experience of God through contemplation of the logos. And this is very much a patristic idea. It's a sort of a mystical apprehension of God. But I'm reminded of Jung's quote, and I don't know where he has this, but he wrote somewhere that the idea of the superego, Freud's superego, is a necessary substitute for an experience of the self. And I just think it's so marvelous not to equate, again, the self with God, because self, even from a Jungian perspective, as much as it may connect to God, as Ulanov writes, it's also part of the created order. And St. Maximus is talking about, apprehension and perceiving of God, of the energies of God. But analogously, this idea that it's not morality that is the thing. Maximus writes this elsewhere. He said that, how do you say it? That the truth does not exist for the sake of virtue. Virtue exists for the sake of the truth. So it's both a guidepost and a byproduct of engagement with the truth.
Yes. We had a lot of discussion, but some discussion on the podcast with different people around this differentiating the superego from conscience, for example. something that Jung also developed his thoughts on in his late essay, A Psychological View of Conscience, where he makes these distinctions and speak of conscience as the vox Dei, or potentially the voice of God, and differentiating that from this internalized father images or images of authority, and the importance of doing that work, like moving from a moral as a sort of idea of the mass to ethics. So I just
to ethics,
and to conscience, and to. So I was actually please.
No, and I'm just thinking in the role, of course, of projection in so much of what is ethical or not ethical, that how we dehumanize others, how we project onto them, that so much of the work of depth psychology and the recollection of projection off of people actually allows for a much greater morality in a way, because you begin to engage with others as others and not just shadow projections or whatever other complex there might be. So I think that the idea that working through these issues actually frees up true conscience, kind of a true ethic of relatedness, makes a lot of sense.
And I mean, this is probably too big of a question, but is there something you could say on conscience, on its role, in the Orthodox tradition? I understand it's a huge question, but I do think you touch on it in the book.
Well, I think that just anecdotally, it's something that is considered to be a prompting of God in the heart. It's a kind of, when someone's struck by a moment of conscience, it's part of how. I mean, I haven't looked at this sort of in depth theologically, but I would myself link it to this notion of the image of God in it. If I'm speaking as a theologian, that the image of God in us, it has this understanding of what's true in it, embedded in it. And when we, again, I really love the works of St. Maximus, and so it comes up a lot when I talk. But to go back to St. Maximus, he talks about how the passions arise when we distort our perception of an object and combine that with one of our natural faculties, like desire or anger. And so it's again, the natural faculty is good. It's been given by God. The capacity for anger is also the capacity for courage, and desire can be love. But when there's a distortion in your perception of something, then the desire becomes lust, or the anger becomes vengefulness, or so they get what they like to use the word distorted. And I think that conscience is that deep knowing in you that something has been distorted here and you're acting on it. But I'm not, I don't know, that's not an area I've examined overly much theologically.
But moving maybe into areas that I know that you have examined deeply in your book, I was thinking about what you just brought up here, eros, and the importance of eros and desire, both in the analytic process, but also then the question of its role in a patristic theology. Your chapter 4 is called Eros, Healing Fire. That's a great title. So could you speak a little bit about eros and desire and what you found in your research there?
Goodness, where to start? Well, I think, again, I mean, so I'm just thinking for a moment how to frame this. But when I was working through this research, there were two things, again, that I stood out at me particularly in a Jungian approach. Though it's also, I mean, I studied many of the other psychoanalysts and really benefited from them as well. And I've always kind of employed an eclectic understanding in my own clinical understanding. So that's just sort of parenthetically. But Jung has both this idea in his method that there is a kind of a psyche that is given. I mean, that we have we have been given, wherever it comes from. Psyche is self. And then there's the, as we talked about earlier, the telos of the person, the journey of the person, right, through life, and their own arc of destiny, and healing, and an analytic, individual. It's basically the path of individuation for them, right? And I was astonished when I was doing this research. I was really pulled to the works of Saint Maximus, and I was actually quite literally dumbfounded when I understood that a basic tenet of Saint Maximus's understanding was what he called what are basically the logos of being, and then the trope of being, meaning that being is given to us, and then there is the trope of being, which is how we, again, our arc through life, that how we go through life, what we do with our own sense of being. So there was a kind of incredible overlap of understanding that made me want to really explore. And so the first part, the kind of the logos of being, the psyche qua psyche, and self as self, that's one of the chapters in the book where I look at what I think was a kind of, it's the image of God, it's the innate impetus towards healing, it's the kind of the blueprint of the self, as Jung talks about. It's kind of what's given, it's what's there, right? And the chapter on Eros is the next part, which is how you go, what takes people from a kind of, not stasis, because it's not static in that way, but a kind of potentia to an actualization, right? To a going out into the world and doing something, to, it's the innate talent to be an architect, and then it's the drive to go to architecture school, right? It's the potential versus the actualization. And I think that in both of those, whether it was Saint Maximus or a more modern day understanding of the person, of course, Eros is key, because Eros is, I think I discuss in that chapter, can be understood in a lot of different ways. It's not just sexual, although it certainly manifests sexually, but it's desire moving out into the world, seeking connection, seeking relatedness, seeking the object of the desire. And so that seemed quite, it seems sort of to make, it was common sense within the psychoanalytic world. It makes sense that desire would be so key. What I was surprised to find was how key it was in the theological world as well, that it's the desire for life, for being, for God. It's the seeking of union with the good that then also creates a kind of, doesn't create, but participates in a thrust of Eros that is also about integration, and not just, again, I think Eros is often confused with lust in our world, and it's not that. It's a deeper, more powerful, broader, richer vein of desire that can unify and can unite, and can unite without confusion different aspects, both of ourselves and of the cosmos, as Maximus talked about. So but we need that thrust, and we need that ability to love. And it's not a sentimental love. It's not a moral love in that, I would say, air quotes around moral, in the sense like it's not, it's full of life, and it's full of fire. And it has to be real. Otherwise it's not Eros. It can't just be a kind of lip service to kindness. So it's I think it's very much related to this core sense of self that we were talking about, and the true sense of self. And of course, God is love in the Christian tradition. So it's all, whether you're contemplating God, you're immersed in love, and the images of fire abound as well. So, but it's hard because then you can say all of that, but then how many of us really live that way? And I think that's where the depth psychologists really, excel, and they all kinds of understandings of where eros can get um, stifled, where it can be shamed, where it can be blocked, where it can be cause of great fear, where it can be attached to the wrong, like Fairbairn's idea that we are connected to internalized objects, even if they're destructive. The abusive parent, the child still loves them because that's their parent. And now, 50 years later, that inner object still is the object of a lot of eros, even though it hurts the psyche of the person, it hurts the person in their life. So it's a very powerful force.
Well, moving to another side, then a link that you're drawing between patristic theology and analytical psychology has to do with the belief in the healing impetus of the psyche, or the reliance of the healing impetus of the psyche.
Right.
Well, I think also listeners are aware that that's a fundament in analytical psychology, but you spent some time also expanding on that in the book.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that is what I was sort of referring to earlier about the kind of the logos of being the image of God in the person from a theological perspective, or the psyche, the self. And I was reminded of this wonderful quote by Anne Ulanov, of paraphrasing a little bit, but that the psyche insists that all of its parts be included, all of its feelers and all of its feathers. And I always get this wonderful image of a caterpillar with feathers coming along. But the psyche can conjure up such strange images for us, and seems so alien and other to us. But this healing impetus, I think, that is such a gracious way of understanding these strange aspects of the psyche that can crop up and be very uncomfortable. It's part of the case to be made for that which is not assumed is not healed, is also that what shows up appears to want integration. It appears to want inclusion. It's not indifferent to its lived outness in our lives, if that makes sense. So again, like a compulsion or a complex or a symptom that keeps bothering us, on the one hand, if you're having panic attacks, I mean, they're absolutely awful and it is just devastating. On the other hand, is there something there that is trying to get included and worked out and brought into life in a different way, whether it's a wound or a desire that seems to be too dangerous to have, so it just seems that in the living of it, there is a desire for inclusion. But I think that is the brilliance of Jung, to say, yes, this symptom is not just a symptom that, again, we want to get rid of so that you're better functioning, or people love to say what's quote unquote normal or what's quote unquote healthy these days, but it's deeper and bigger and I would say better than that. It's not just about being functional, it's about living. And so there seems to be fundamentally a deep desire for life that can then get very distorted because of the hand we've been dealt and the choices we make, or some combination of both. So I think from it's very important to see that from a depth psychological perspective, and then just to say, well, that makes perfect sense, because if the image of God lives in us, what's it doing? I mean, just being very practical about it, like what would the point of it be if it means nothing in our lived lives? And this was a way of wondering if this is part of what that is. This is part of the image of God.
And is there this type of openness also in the Orthodox experience, or as you experience it, for also I'm thinking now for desire, for the passions, for sort of seeing and putting value to the longings of the body. Often, I guess, stereotypically we look at most Christian sort of traditions as against that, or
Right.
not disown that.
I think it's difficult to say it's one thing.
Yeah.
I can speak anecdotally and say that I've had mixed reception. I think there have been times when I have floated some of these ideas. For example, I remember there was an article on internet pornography addiction, and they were talking exactly about, this is a psychological article about this was a kind of really a desire for intimacy and connection, and should be understood as such. And I took it to a priest and professor and said, "What do you think?" And he said, "That's exactly an Orthodox approach. That's how we would understand it too." And I thought, wow, I wasn't expecting that. But, I've also heard others, it depends, priest to priest, church to church, and not because the theology is actually that individual, but I think people, they take it and understand it in their own ways and in light of their own background. And so you can certainly find a great warning against images of sexuality, of passion. I think that they, even in the early church, talked about how, when trying to do the liturgy or to do something, to engage in deep prayer, that, the demons will send images of erotic temptation to derail you. And so I don't think that by and large in the church, if someone has something like that, they go, "Oh, this is great. Let's just see what this image is all about." But the reason I think the conversation is worth continuing to have is because there is a deep respect for desire. And there is a deep, particularly in the patristics, focus on eros as a almost as like a power of God, right? That it's there. So that's true. But then there's, of course, the idea that that's not meant to be focused. The difference is going to be on the object of the desire, because it's one thing to love another person, but it's relativized by the love of God, if that makes sense. It's included within the love of God, which is supposed to be, and what is the struggle throughout life to be the primary love. So it's not, "Oh, I love chocolate croissants and I'm just going to eat as many as I can because that's my, my right, and that's my desire, and I'm living life fully." It's and that's not even a very good example, but I think I'm just trying to say that the passions are constrained by an understanding of what's supposed to be ultimate.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other side, you can say, well, sometimes therapy seems like it just unlooses the passions, and everyone says, "Oh, good, well, now I'm not repressed anymore." But that, but then where does it go? Does it have a kind of life-giving telos for the person? And I think that the idea that it just unlooses the passions and doesn't send them anywhere useful is often a religious suspicion of therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a kind of, it's again, these are complicated areas to navigate and require respect for both sides, because there also often are assumptions about both sides.
Well, we have already touched on such fundamental questions for our human existence, and how the field of Orthodox theology and Christianity engage with that, and also the field of analytical psychology. It's been already very rich, so I'm sort of hesitant to add this last question because it's not a huge one, but I think I'll try still.
Okay.
And that is, you are also making a brief excursion on death. I think you write it like that, and trying to look at and describe how analytical psychology and Orthodox Christianity looks at death. And you say, like, biological death is not the whole death. That death is not as an opposite to immortality, but to the true life.
Mhm.
I thought that, yeah, felt very fundamental. And if you could just say a few more words about your exploration of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think again it's tricky, but it kind of was born out of, this idea they say in the church that Christ has defeated death.
Mhm.
And okay, but everybody's still dying, so what does that mean? And on the one hand, again, speaking theologically, you can say, well, what it means for eternity and the resurrection of all people to the life to come, and that this isn't the only life, and that there's a life beyond this. But again, Jung would say, well, I don't know anything about the life beyond this one. I can only talk about this one. And I think that both Orthodox Christianity and depth psychology could agree that there are, I hesitate to even say people, but just to start by saying that there are people who live dead even though they're alive, that who seem as though they're sort of dead on the inside even though they're alive. And I think even that's a bit of a straw man, but it's that there are pieces of us that are dead
Mhm.
even while we're alive, or there are pieces of us that are dormant or as if dead. And there are times in our lives when we live, but we feel dead inside. And I don't just mean by dead, we feel nothing, or we feel like, but we can feel like we're not there. We can feel like we're one step removed from our lives. We can feel like nothing we do helps and nothing ever changes. We can feel despair. We can feel walled off. There's so many ways to experience a kind of deadness, and we can keep living while we're doing that. Inside biologically, we're living and we're getting up and making coffee and, maybe getting the kids to school or getting ourselves to work or whatever it is. But there's that kind of deadness, and we can look at the reasons for why that is. I think despair is usually a big part of it, but the idea that can be changed, that we can, again, Ulanov, in one of her books, I think it was her book on poison ivy, at the end of it says that the goal of a depth analysis is not health. It's not to acquire the ability to have symbolic thinking. It's not, it's not a cerebral exercise or exercise in self-insight. It's to come alive. It's livingness. It's that sense that you were just deeply alive and connected to life. And, and I think that's the analog on the depth psychological side. And I think on the to life and to death. And I think on the theological side, that there is a sense that people experience in the sacraments of healing, in communion, in confession, of touching and being touched by a life, a sense of life that is beyond us, that is the uncreated energy, that is a kind of radiance that comes in, so that even as you're struggling with your dead parts, and maybe are in an analysis or therapy at the same time wrestling out these dead parts, there's also this uncreated life, and that is being offered and to participate in, and that you can do even though you will physically die someday. So it's sort of an interesting place to end, right? Because actually we're back right on the point of, there are analogs, but they're not the same, because the Orthodox Church is talking about God's uncreated energies, and you can, if you're not going to psychologize it, then you have to respect that that's what they're claiming. And on the other side, there is the deep psychological work of working through your own dead spaces and into life. You can bring those two together. They're not the same, but they can meet, and they do meet, which is, I believe, which is why I was trying to write this book.
Well, it sounds indeed like a good place to stop.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And thank you so much for sharing with us and taking
Thank
the
you.
time. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you so much, Jakob. It's a pleasure.